My talk is actually based on another talk which I gave some months ago, which was for the Building on a Built lecture series at Jonathan Taki studio. And while I was preparing for that lecture, I became conscious of how much of my work actually deals with the reuse of buildings and with the subject of derelict, forgotten structures, and also of recommissioning old buildings. So I realized that while a lot of my more sort of livelihood-based work deals with new iconic architecture, my sort of heart lies in the kind of forgotten structures. And so that is the background why kind of possibly why I became a filmmaker rather than an architect as well, is that fact that I was always more interested in the context of buildings and the stories around them rather than in the buildings themselves as objects. And still, even with the more commercial work, I'm always very interested in where it comes from and how the architect works with the context and what the client is about and what the story is behind. And so since my mother tongue, so to speak, is moving image rather than English, I'm going to use film clips to demonstrate these issues about reuse of buildings. So for me, sustainability is not only important in terms of environmental impact, but especially in terms of culture. And as new buildings are increasingly world over kind of becoming more and more similar, and often relate little to the location. So me, cultural sustainability, as I like to call it, means that every building project should start with the existing context and looking into the historic traces and ghosts that occupy that space. And by ghosts, I mean the kind of legacy and the memory and everything that constitutes that space and the programs that take place there. And I don't think it's really a romantic or aesthetic issue for me. It's more of the fundamental question of meaning of architecture. I have playfully named this lecture Time Remapping. Time Remapping is an artificial construct of a word developed by the Adobe software company for the video production softwares. Time remapping is really the method within a film clip to manipulate the time curve so that parts are slowed down and others are sped up. So this is a kind of demonstration of time remapping, which you might have just missed. And that's how I see the lifespan of a building as well, in the sense that after the kind of intense building construction phase, nothing much changes within the building itself, sometimes for hundreds of years if it's about a historic building. And then suddenly, when the building is kind of recommissioned or restructured or demolished or burns down, the kind of the history or the time speeds up. And equally, you can also reverse time. And I like the situation of Warsaw in Poland, which after the Second World War was rebuilt after it was complete. The old town was completely demolished by bombings, and at that time it was not built how it was just before the war, but referencing 18th century drawings by Canaletto. And that story kind of demonstrates how history can be reversed as well in an interesting way. And and that kind of comment opens a kind of worms about authenticity. And I don't know what I think of authenticity as a concept myself, but to paraphrase artist Madeline Wiesendorp, who says that authenticity is so overrated. And also, it's a horrible word to pronounce. So. Sometimes the most beautiful things are created with no aesthetical motivation at all. So the Red Sands Fort in Thames Estuary is very timely in this era of isolation and quarantine. It's a really extreme example of something that was built for a very, very specific purpose, and it's difficult to reutilize. I'm currently using this footage to create a music video for my electronic artist friend Mikko Karhu, whose track is in the background, and this song also deals with this idea of loneliness and looking backwards and contemplating. And it's this type of industrial vernacular architecture that is most exciting for the imagining of reuse of programs. And the question is also how you can turn something that is initially part of a destructive war machine, like this fort from the Second World War, and do something constructive about it. So, as a filmmaker, I see my role merely as asking questions rather than providing answers to these questions. So many of my films, I feel like they're really there to pose questions rather than creating some kind of design solutions as such. Another related issue which has interested me quite some time is the question: what is the future of the built legacy of dilapidated political systems? Many years ago, with my previous business partner Christian Grew, we did an extensive and obsessive study of socialist housing estates across Eastern Europe, all the way to Western Siberia. A kind of continuation of this process has been the study of Bucharest with my friend Ioana Marinescu, who has spent many years researching these issues. Many of the structures that were designed for the socialist regime were never completed, and 30 years later many of them remain in a state of ruin, and some have been kind of repurposed for the new democratic state. And of course, the other issue is that this building, this palace, which was meant as kind of private residence for a crazy dictator, has now reused as the democratic parliament of the nation. And the big question is how it is possible to recommission buildings like that for a completely different political situation, and whether that works at all. And again, that's just a question I'm posing and contemplating. That's some of the kind of colossal socialist neighborhoods, and often it's forgotten that hundreds of millions of people still live in the socialist housing blocks all across Eastern Europe, and and Russia. And another interest is, of course, the industrial legacy and the kind of sorrow I feel for all the cooling towers that are disused and or demolished, and that there's no way to kind of recommission them to something better. And this is possibly the most fascinating bit of Bucharest for me, is this trace of a massive theater complex, where you only see the literally the scar or the trace of the building site, which was then stopped after a revolution. It's of course not just dictatorships and socialist societies that have a strange legacy of built environments. Uh, I find it just endlessly fascinating that there has been nobody has come up with a solution for what to do with a city like Detroit, which was kind of deemed beyond its sell-by date. As it had been in the maybe between the world wars, it was possibly the wealthiest city in the entire world, and after the car industry and weapons industry, etc., declined after the wars and later in the 70s, 80s. So the only sort of social solution that the city government and came up with was to demolish a city block by block. And what I is of course funny and fascinating is that now that you look at the footage of Detroit, it's not so unfamiliar. All these empty streets and this solitude and lonely people here and there, because we are experiencing that everywhere in the world at the moment. What is different about Detroit, that all these buildings you see are also more or less unoccupied, and there's some signs of a kind of comeback that are happening in Detroit as well, but it's a very slow process. And this, what is most interesting to me is that it hasn't really got to do so much with the reality of the Detroit itself, but it has a lot to do with its reputation. In contrast to a city like Detroit, London can of course be described as a commercially successful city, and it's indeed a massive building site at the moment, where 500 tall residential buildings are either in planning or being constructed at the moment. And to enable that, many neighborhoods are destroyed and many buildings are demolished, and some of them are quite worthwhile, precious buildings. An example of that is Robin Hood Gardens, a housing development by Allison and Peter Smithson from the 1960s. It is seen as one of the most important brutalist architectural projects, and for years architects have fought for it to be listed so that it could be protected from developers, and I had the opportunity to film it shortly before the western part of the estate was demolished. The other part has still got a couple of years extension. This project is really a comment about accepting whatever you find and seeing value in it and taking inspiration from it. It's not about preserving a valuable structure. Several years ago I was commissioned to create a 6,000 square meter air cleaning painting along a motorway underpass in the center of Manila in the Philippines. And Cubao, the location of the painting, is one of the most important intersections of train lines and motorways in the city, and it's also a location of the biggest bus terminus. And my instinct was not find a kind of way to decorate it with something alien and pretty, but to really celebrate whatever it was that I could find in that location. Edsa is one of the most congested and polluted motorways anywhere in the world, and it's really encircles possibly the most densely populated city on Earth at the moment. So I wanted to see the underpass as a section through this city, and the painting as a window to see the underground infrastructure that sustains the life of a city. So as a filmmaker, I love working on haunted houses. It's not that I believe in ghosts, but what I mean by haunted is that you can sense the generations of occupants and come up with stories that also help you create an imaginary narrative for the film. So I often, especially when I'm filming a house where I'm by myself and I'm not surrounded by people, I feel I kind of have to tell a story of a house and its occupants and previous occupants, if it's kind of a restructured house, or and it's a feeling that you're surrounded by stories and meaning and culture that enriches the architectural experience you are in. And this film is about a house in Galicia designed by Jamie Faubert and Dominic Gagnon, and built into an ancient vernacular farmhouse. It's surrounded by a labyrinth of ancient tracks through reeds and pine forests, which connect the location with the village and the sea, and it has this kind of elements of the current time, but also like this feeling of the ancient and the mysterious, and I like said, I've been working with Jamie Faubert on several projects, and many of them have this capacity and element of dealing with historic structures, but making them ultra modern at the same time as they are kind of timeless and archaic, and I quite enjoy that. This is not an architectural conversion either, but it's a completely different project. It's an example of how art can revive a dormant building, and this project called Dialogue 2013 was a site-specific dance performance for which I designed 5 video installations, and both for video and performance art. I find site-specific performances and screenings often more touching than established, than kind of seeing performances and art in galleries and theaters. And both video and video projection and dance was integrated in this old house in Kolkata in India. So a bit like Detroit, Kolkata was also once enormously wealthy and influential, and then because of historic and economic events, it was sidelined. Many of these palaces were built in the 18th century by wealthy Bengali merchants, and this is one of these palaces, which is actually still occupied partly by the family, who are very poor and can really only occupy a little corner in the house because there's no way they could afford to maintain or occupy the entire building. And what is amazing about this building is the kind of ghosts that still occupied, in the sense that there was a bedroom which hadn't been slept in for maybe 50 years, but the bed sheets were still in the bed, and this kind of element of trying to then, through projection and of course through dance, to bring it to life in a different way when it hasn't actually been occupied for a very long time. And I also found some archival footage of old historic Bengali films, which I then projected into these very intimate spaces, and also trying to kind of bridge, make a connection between the dance and the building, and through this projection. That's a kind of interesting challenge. So just to speed up things, so one of the elements was also bringing projections across the street, projecting from that palace across the street to the vis-a-vis wall, and then therefore kind of including the public into this performance, and getting the attention that something odd was happening in this neighborhood. Another example was this old blackened moldy paintings, which used to be kind of beautiful Italian Renaissance paintings and whatever, which were bought for this house, to project on them and to create kind of take people from the street and project them onto these paintings, onto these portraits, and have this kind of ongoing fading over of different faces and so on. So why did I show this? Anyway, I'm a bit confused. It's a project from the other side of the world, from Brazil, which is also about various overlapping programs, and also kind of converting an old factory into a building with different functions. It was designed by the Brazilian architect Lina Bubardi, who was remarkable in the sense that for her the program was always more important than the architecture itself. Almost architecture was a second thought after the programs had been thought through, and at least in this building, which is the Sesc Pompeia Cultural Center in São Paulo. It was built in the 1980s, but it also kind of has this archaic, timeless industrial feel, but it hasn't aged at all since the 80s when it was designed, and these massive concrete structures also kind of create a new vernacular which didn't really exist, but seemed so completely right for that purpose and that place. This film was commissioned as part of the exhibition Lina Bubardi together, created by Noemi Blaha, who of course was the previous director of the Architecture Foundation. I spent several weeks in this compound, just witnessing people, how they use space, how this building is kind of adapting to people, whether they were kind of visiting opera performance or dancing tango, or going to a rock concert, or going to the dentist, or taking the kids to play football. All these layers of different occupation programs happening at the same time in this kind of very tough, brutal mass of concrete and industrial sort of poetry. Last but not least is maybe the oddest project of them all. It's an informal settlement, which can also be described as a slum in Seoul, in South Korea, and a bit like Rio de Janeiro, the steep hillsides in Seoul used to be occupied by different kinds of informal settlements, very dense villages, which were called moon villages. And of course, as South Korea became more and more wealthy and industrialized, most of them were demolished and replaced by tower blocks, and people were occupied, inhabiting different kinds of typographies, and only one of them, or one or two of them, are still in existence. And very interestingly, this new city architect, when he got his job, he started campaigning for one of them to be preserved and recommissioned and not to be destroyed, like was likely to happen because of economic forces. And I was introduced to this project by Florian Bagel and Philip Christo, who I was very touched how they, when they were asked by the city architect to think about ways of giving this area new leaves of life, how they went there and tried to kind of learn from what is there, and kind of subtly and humbly translate the kind of materiality and the aesthetics and the optical, and also the social structures, and then try to think how it would be possible to replace these buildings without destroying the structure. And like many of these projects, making this film was based on the idea that I wanted to document it before it would be either disappearing or would be changed completely, and have this document of the past. And now, ever since, I don't really know what has happened in a few years since. But already then, it was there were less and less people living there, mostly quite aged, and people who would struggle to live in these steep hillsides and find these little alleyways. But it's a very beautiful, poetic place, and very different from the ultra-modern, intense urbanscape of Seoul. So, like many of these projects, this is also, let's say, happened as a side product of a more commercial trip that I did, and which then gave me an opportunity to investigate these ideas that I'm talking about. And that's the end of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tapio. Maybe if I could kick off. Just, I guess, yeah. Could you say a little? I mean, I know we were having problems with sound, but could you say something about the kind of the approach to music or to the soundtrack that you're adopting in these films? I mean, it was kind of much clearer in the later ones than the ones we struggled with a bit at the beginning. But how do you approach the question of how to make a soundtrack out of?
It's a good question. I mean, now in my turn to barely hear you because of the bloody settings. Anyway, music, I find it difficult to describe because it's such an intuitive reaction. It's definitely not. I don't usually take cultural clues when I choose music for my films, and sometimes I mostly hope to have the luxury of working with a musician in collaboration to do something specific, but that usually doesn't happen. But I think it's just something that I mean, I'm always more concerned about the the pace and atmosphere and mood and volume and all that, rather than the style of music. So whether it's electronic or classical or ethnic or whatever, is in a way for me less important than what it kind of does with the sound and how with the image. Sorry, and I'm at the same. Having said that, I'm quite dependent on the music because I find it almost impossible to cut, edit film without having a soundtrack to react to. So it usually happens in parallel, but I need sound to. Sometimes I even have a music track which I use to edit a film, but then I discard the music track afterwards. But it has given it somehow a sort of structure and length and intensity.
And Tapio, do you see the work you're making as part of other filmmakers that have inspired the way that you work, or do you look more to art practice? What what are they? Yeah, you don't. Are there connections there that you draw?
It's not that I would name any names and say that I get inspiration from this or that filmmaker. And I work quite in isolation in the sense that I don't even know if I'm a proper filmmaker, but it doesn't really matter because I have my own way of working. But it's often when I'm really working intensely on a film piece, I don't really want to see any other moving image because it will sort of make me feel insecure or confuse me or whatever. So I don't really know, and that's why I've kind of, as an excuse for this insecurity, or I still use the term architect as well, that I somehow the way I approach a film is often quite structural, and I don't really start from beginning, or it's not really it's more like a sort of sketch of something which then is elaborated and made into a more solid structure, and then the end is the solution to the end and the middle and the front, and it's maybe a different way than most people who have actually gone through an education in filmmaking would approach that discipline.
Tapio, we're getting some questions in. I'm going to open up the mic for Jamie Faubert, who's...
Oh no.
Jamie.
Well, I was just interested in your idea of ghosts, and you spoke about the fact that you've done a number of films for us. I thought it was quite interesting. A little while ago, there was a talk with the Architecture Review, and they talked about, they had a photographer, and the photographer talked very much about how irritating it was to have architects try to art direct the film shoot. And I remember this from a very early film shoot, a very early photographic shoot where I tried to make the photographer take the right photographs, and it was a disaster. And Joanna is here, and she went to Ireland and did a beautiful shoot. And basically I learned at that point that the best thing to do is introduce them to the place and the client and leave them alone. In fact, she stayed there for 3 days. But I really think it's an important point you make about being alone with the architecture to actually be able to create something unique and to have your perspective rather than a kind of repetition of the architect's own preoccupations. Do you think that's no longer a question?
Well, I think the ideal scenario often for me would be to first get to a building or a space without having any briefing whatsoever. So to start a project without having a clue what is expected. And then, of course, start a conversation with the client or architect or whoever I work with or for. But I like the kind of, like the loneliness and the kind of listening at the ghosts or looking at things, traces, and especially if it's about a historic building which has different layers of meaning and so on. And yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but one thing you said recently about the building you were working on, which quite touched me, when you said that the client is spending a huge amount of effort and money, and you're working so hard to revert something so that you wouldn't see that it had nothing, anything has ever happened in that building in a way. So that kind of that I find extremely valuable and sort of poetic as a thought, that an architect would actually revert a building into something which doesn't really show that he's been working hard. So
we've got a question from Anna about Detroit. Anna, I'm going to unmute you. Oh, sorry. Anna, there you are.
Hi, Tapio.
I
No, I was just very curious because the bit about Detroit was just fascinating. I wondered, did you have a chance to visit the Packard factory?
yeah.
Because I wondered what it inspired you in being in those spaces, because it's almost like a mini city within the city, right, of Detroit. I mean, it's a vast complex. So I just wondered what you thought about the space, what maybe inspiration you took from that, or...
Well, that's why I stopped being an architect, because I it's not that I don't come up with ideas about how to redesign or how to reoccupy a building, but I just I'm fascinated by the potential of all that, and Detroit is just amazing for that. I mean, it just has, every corner has this amazing potential, and also it's of course sadness because a lot of the potential has been already destroyed. I mean, they have actually one after the other destroyed big historic buildings just to kind of make space for nothingness. So I just sort of big question mark the whole experience with Detroit. But what is maybe very important for that experience is going there from Chicago and everyone saying like, why the hell would you go to Detroit? There's nothing to see and it's very dangerous and horrible. Don't go. That was even with quite sort of interesting personalities with lots to say, they would just completely strike it off and say it's not worth it. So, and that of course made me even more sort of determined to find some. And then of course the experience of being in Detroit is incredible, because you have all these people coming to you in the street and thanking you for coming to visit them because of that stigma that it has for some reason. So it's just it's kind of had this weird sensation of wanting to actually spend, almost like move there for a while. So, but specifically, I mean, there's also like this Freemasons Hall, and I mean, it's a massive, big public, or not so public buildings, which are just full of potential and wealth. But I think they're doing something with the factory, so there's some kind of idea of building something. And there's a kind of a slow food movement because of the farms going up in the derelict city corners where buildings have been removed and replaced with agriculture. And so it is a fascinating place.
Could I just ask about, obviously we've been watching all your films here on Zoom, but I'm kind of conscious of the fact that you make films to be shown in quite different physical contexts. Sometimes, in the relationship to performance, and so sometimes they're solely for kind of internet use. And but you've also worked on the Lina Babadi's show that travelled. For example, although I mentioned at the beginning, I think the work you did in the Venice Biennale in 2006 when you were working with Ricky Burdett on the kind of articulation of the big exhibition down the length of the Arsenale. Could you perhaps just say something about that aspect of of your work about how you think of you approach the task of making films that actually ultimately have to respond to the real spaces in which they're exhibited?
Well, that's a kind of mystery. I'd like to know how. I like to show my films more, and like to find. It's just they seem to never be right for any specific sort of existing context. So I enjoy showing films in interesting spaces, and I don't think they work very well on sort of cinema kind of context in festivals, and the exhibitions would need to be really specific because the themes are quite specific. So I don't know. That's why I'm also kind of wanting to get more out there with different kinds of films that I've been working on, to also maybe find answers or reactions to that and say, hey, this film should definitely belongs to that place or that context, which, yeah, I wouldn't know. And in a way, I wish I wouldn't need to think about that question. I would just be able to make films, and then someone else would tell me what to do with them. That would be the ideal scenario.
Thank you. We have one late question has come in from Joanna, and so I'm going to pitch that one to you, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay.
No? Hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. It's very interesting because I was wondering, what was your decision behind turning the footage from Robin Hood Garden in black and white, and also the Bucharest footage in negative? I mean, there's the two projects that we somehow work together, or were sort of close. I was close to you when you were doing that, and it's quite surprising to see them.
It's
color out, or sort of manipulating it. So if you can talk a bit about it.
Yeah, well, it's intuition mostly, but in Robin Hood Gardens one, it was kind of timelessness, trying to, of course, the drone kind of footage is extremely now and hasn't been available for many years, but I wanted to kind of play with the idea of it possibly be seen as a kind of 60s documentation from the time of when the estate was created. For the Romania, it was quite a different reason. I kind of inverted it, or like used a red channel to transform the footage to look very different in a way, because I wanted it to look sort of analytical, like an X-ray of an era. So it wasn't. I also enjoy the fact that it almost doesn't look like real footage. It looks like animation or some kind of a analytical, weird sort of espionage footage of something. I don't know. It was kind of playful. I mean, especially in the Romania, that film hasn't been completed. There was no resolution. That's kind of one of the projects where I would love to have a budget and a time to do like a sort of more thorough and more academic investigation into the subject matter. So it was very shallow, spending a few days in Bucharest and just getting started with those ideas. It was very inspiring, but I still wanted to make something out of it. So this was a playful way of dealing with it. That's how, the best I can say. There's no.
Thank you. I also wanted to say I tried to photograph some of those structures for years and had no access to them. And it was quite wonderful being with Tapio on quiet days, and him flying the drones through a relatively empty city, capturing things that can't be otherwise done in any way. So it's
Yeah, I mean, the drone has been completely overused everywhere at the moment, and I overused it myself in a way. But there's certain moments where you can really do something which was impossible before, and which can be quite profound.